The desert sun blazed mercilessly over Fallujah as Marine Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her rifle scope one final time. She had been stationed in this war-torn Iraqi city for 8 months, leading a convoy security team through some of the most dangerous streets in the world. At 28 years old, Maria had already seen more combat than most soldiers experience in entire careers, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to unfold on this scorching Tuesday morning in September 2004. Maria's team was tasked with escorting a humanitarian convoy carrying medical supplies to a makeshift hospital in the heart of Fallujah. The mission seemed routine on paper, but every Marine knew that in this city, routine missions could turn deadly in seconds. The streets were lined with bombed-out buildings, their skeletal remains serving as perfect hiding spots for insurgents who had turned urban warfare into a deadly art form. As the convoy rolled through the narrow streets, Maria maintained constant radio contact with her 6-person team. Corporal Jenkins drove the lead Humvee while Private Rodriguez manned the mounted machine gun. The familiar weight of her body armor pressed against her chest as she scanned the rooftops through her binoculars, searching for any sign of movement that might indicate an ambush. The local children who usually waved at American convoys were nowhere to be seen. The marketplace that typically bustled with activity stood eerily empty. These were the warning signs that experienced soldiers learned to read like a survival manual. Maria's instincts screamed danger, but the mission had to continue. Too many Iraqi civilians were depending on the medical supplies they carried. 3 blocks from their destination, the world exploded around them. The first rocket-propelled grenade struck the rear vehicle, sending a ball of fire and smoke into the desert air. Maria's voice crackled over the radio as she coordinated her team's response. But before she could finish her sentence, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. The insurgents had planned this ambush perfectly, positioning themselves in a deadly crossfire that trapped the convoy in a killing zone. Maria's Humvee took the brunt of the initial assault. Bullets shattered the reinforced windows as she dove for cover, her mind racing through combat protocols even as chaos surrounded her. She could hear Jenkins shouting over the engine noise, trying to maneuver the vehicle to safety while Rodriguez returned fire with everything he had. The sound of gunfire was deafening, mixing with the screams of wounded Marines and the thunderous explosions of grenades. In those first terrible minutes, Maria made the decision that would define her legacy. Instead of seeking cover, she exposed herself to enemy fire to direct her team's defensive positions. Her voice remained steady over the radio as she called in their coordinates to command headquarters, even as bullets whizzed past her head. She spotted muzzle flashes from a second-story window and directed Rodriguez's machine gun fire to suppress the threat. The firefight intensified as more insurgents joined the battle. Maria realized they were outnumbered at least 3-1, possibly more. The enemy had chosen their position well, using the narrow street to channel the convoy into their trap. Escape routes were limited, and with wounded Marines in multiple vehicles, retreat would be nearly impossible without leaving someone behind. As Maria moved between vehicles to check on her team, she felt the first bullet tear through her left shoulder. The impact spun her around, but adrenaline kept her moving. She pressed a field dressing against the wound and continued coordinating the defense. 2 more bullets found their mark, one grazing her leg and another lodging in her protective vest. The pain was becoming overwhelming, but she refused to let her team see weakness. The battle had been raging for nearly an hour when Maria spotted insurgents attempting to flank their position from the east. If they succeeded, her entire team would be surrounded with no hope of survival. Without hesitation, she grabbed her rifle and ammunition, leaving the relative safety of her Humvee to take up a defensive position that would give her a clear shot at the flanking force. Her last radio transmission was characteristic of her leadership style, calm and professional despite the impossible circumstances she faced. She reported the flanking movement to her team and requested immediate air support, though she knew help was still minutes away. As she settled into position behind a concrete barrier, Maria Santos prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to save the Marines under her command. The Iraqi sun continued its relentless assault as the sound of gunfire echoed through the ancient streets of Fallujah, where one Marine's courage was about to become legend. The concrete barrier that provided Maria's cover began to disintegrate under the relentless barrage of enemy fire. Chunks of cement exploded around her as she took careful aim at the insurgents attempting to surround her team. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and blood had begun to seep through the hastily applied field dressing, but her hands remained steady on her rifle. Through her scope, Maria could see at least 8 insurgents moving through the rubble of a collapsed building, using the debris as cover while they advanced on her Marine's flanks. She knew that if they reached the alley behind Jenkins' Humvee, her entire team would be trapped in a crossfire with no escape route. The weight of 6 lives rested on her ability to hold this position. Her first shot dropped the lead insurgent, causing the others to scatter for better cover. This bought her team precious time, but Maria knew she was now the primary target for every enemy fighter in the area. Bullets began striking the concrete barrier with increasing frequency, each impact sending sharp fragments of stone flying around her position. Rodriguez's machine gun fell silent, and Maria's heart sank as she heard Jenkins calling for a medic over the radio. She wanted to move to help her wounded Marines, but abandoning her position would mean certain death for everyone. The insurgents were already regrouping, and she could see more fighters moving through the buildings across the street. The 4th bullet struck Maria in her right leg, just below the knee. The impact knocked her off balance, and for a moment her vision went white with pain. But as her hearing returned, she could hear Jenkins desperately calling her name over the radio. His voice carried a note of panic that she had never heard before, and she realized her team was beginning to lose hope. Fighting through the pain, Maria repositioned herself and resumed firing. Each shot had to count now, as her ammunition was running low and her accuracy was being affected by blood loss. She methodically engaged each target, forcing the insurgents to keep their heads down and slowing their advance. But for every fighter she eliminated, another seemed to take his place. The 5th and 6th bullets hit almost simultaneously, one striking her chest and lodge in her body armor, while another tore through her left arm. The impact from the chest shot knocked the wind out of her, and she struggled to breathe as the damaged armor pressed against her ribs. Her left arm had gone numb, making it difficult to steady her rifle properly. Despite her deteriorating condition, Maria continued to fight. She had already been hit 6 times, but her determination only grew stronger with each wound. Through pure force of will, she maintained her position and kept the insurgents at bay, buying time for the air support that she hoped was still coming. The 7th bullet shattered her radio, destroying her last link to her team and command headquarters. Now she was truly alone, fighting a battle she couldn't win but refusing to surrender. The silence from her radio was almost as terrifying as the gunfire, as she could no longer coordinate with her Marines or call for help. Bullets 8, 9, and 10 came in rapid succession as the insurgents realized her radio was down and pressed their attack. One bullet struck her in the stomach, another grazed her neck, and the third shattered her rifle scope. Blood was now flowing freely from multiple wounds, and her vision began to blur as shock started to set in. Still, Maria fought on. Using iron sights on her damaged rifle, she continued to engage the enemy with whatever strength remained. Her breathing became labored, and each movement sent waves of agony through her battered body. But she refused to let her team down. She had sworn an oath to protect the Marines under her command, and that oath meant more to her than her own life. The 11th and 12th bullets struck within seconds of each other, one hitting her in the back and another in her right arm. The force of the impacts drove her to the ground behind the disintegrating concrete barrier. Her rifle fell from her weakening grip, and for the first time since the battle began, Maria couldn't immediately return to the fight. As she lay bleeding in the Iraqi dust, Maria could hear the insurgents advancing on her position. Their voices grew louder as they realized she was down, and she knew they would overrun her defensive position within minutes. With tremendous effort, she reached for her sidearm, determined to make her last stand with whatever strength remained in her broken body. The 13th bullet found its mark as she struggled to draw her pistol, striking her in the side and spinning her around. But even as her strength faded, Maria's warrior spirit burned bright. She managed to fire 3 shots from her pistol before the 14th and final bullet struck her in the chest, finally bringing down the Marine who had single-handedly held off an entire insurgent force to save her team. The 14th bullet brought Maria's heroic stand to an end, but her sacrifice had achieved its purpose. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air as the long-awaited air support finally arrived over Fallujah. Apache gunships swooped down like mechanical angels of vengeance, their chain guns tearing through the insurgent positions with devastating precision. Corporal Jenkins watched in horror through his cracked windshield as Maria's position was overrun by enemy fighters. He had lost radio contact with her when her communications equipment was destroyed, but the sudden silence from her rifle told him everything he needed to know. His squad leader, the woman who had saved all their lives, was down. The arriving air support quickly turned the tide of battle. The insurgents, who had been so confident in their ambush, now found themselves exposed and vulnerable to attack from above. Within minutes, the enemy fighters were either dead or fleeing through the maze of bombed-out buildings that had provided them with such perfect cover just moments before. As the immediate threat was neutralized, Jenkins made the agonizing decision to move his surviving team members to Maria's last known position. Private Rodriguez, wounded but still conscious, provided covering fire while Jenkins and the other surviving Marines advanced through the debris-strewn street. Each step was a risk, as scattered insurgents might still be hiding in the ruins, but they couldn't abandon their squad leader. What they found when they reached Maria's position would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Their sergeant lay motionless behind the shattered concrete barrier, her body bearing the evidence of her incredible courage. 14 entry wounds marked her uniform, each one a testament to her refusal to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Jenkins immediately called for a medical evacuation while checking for any signs of life. Maria's pulse was barely detectable, and her breathing was so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The medic who arrived with the helicopter crew took one look at her condition and shook his head grimly. No one should have been able to survive that many gunshot wounds, yet somehow Maria was still clinging to life. The helicopter evacuation to the military hospital in Baghdad was a race against time. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize Maria's condition during the 20-minute flight, administering blood transfusions and emergency medications to keep her heart beating. Her injuries were so severe that the doctors couldn't understand how she had remained conscious long enough to continue fighting. At the hospital, Maria was immediately rushed into emergency surgery. The operating room team worked for 6 hours, removing bullets and repairing damaged organs while fighting to save her life. The head surgeon, a veteran military doctor who had seen countless combat injuries, later described Maria's case as the most severe he had ever encountered in a survivor. During the surgery, the medical team discovered that 3 of the bullets had missed vital organs by millimeters. Her body armor had stopped 2 rounds that would have been instantly fatal, and a small religious medal she wore around her neck had deflected another bullet away from her heart. It seemed as though divine intervention had played a role in keeping her alive. While Maria fought for her life in the operating room, news of her heroic actions spread throughout the military base. Fellow Marines gathered in the hospital waiting area, many of them battle-hardened veterans who had rarely shown emotion. But Maria's story affected them all, and grown men who had faced death countless times found themselves wiping away tears. The 6 Marines whose lives Maria had saved visited the hospital daily, taking turns maintaining a vigil outside her room. Jenkins blamed himself for not being able to provide better support during the firefight, but the other survivors reminded him that without Maria's sacrifice, none of them would have lived to feel guilty about anything. 3 days after the surgery, Maria began to show signs of consciousness. Her first words were characteristic of her selfless nature, asking about the condition of her team members rather than her own injuries. When Jenkins assured her that everyone had survived because of her actions, Maria simply nodded and asked if the medical supplies had reached their intended destination. The doctors informed Maria that her recovery would be long and difficult. Some of her injuries would require additional surgeries, and she would likely face months of physical rehabilitation. Several of the bullets remained lodged in locations too dangerous to remove, meaning she would carry pieces of that battle inside her body for the rest of her life. But the most devastating news came when the medical team explained that her injuries were severe enough to end her military career. Maria had always planned to serve her full 20 years in the Marines, and the thought of leaving her brothers and sisters in arms was more painful than any of her physical wounds. As word of Maria's condition spread beyond the military base, her story began to capture the attention of people around the world. News reports described the Marine sergeant who had been shot 14 times while saving her team, and letters of support began arriving from across America and beyond. 2,000 miles away from the military hospital in Baghdad, Lieutenant Commander Jake Harrison was briefing his SEAL team on their next mission in Afghanistan when an urgent message arrived from Joint Special Operations Command. The communication was marked with the highest priority classification, indicating that whatever operation they were about to receive would supersede all other assignments. Harrison had served with SEAL Team 6 for 8 years, leading some of the most dangerous rescue missions in the Middle East. His team was known for their ability to extract personnel from seemingly impossible situations, and they had never failed to bring someone home. But the mission brief that landed on his desk that evening was unlike anything they had encountered before. The intelligence report detailed Maria's situation with clinical precision. She was being held in a heavily fortified insurgent stronghold in eastern Fallujah, captured during a coordinated attack on the military convoy that had been transporting her to a forward medical facility. The insurgents had specifically targeted her because of the propaganda value of holding the Marine, who had become a symbol of American resistance. What made this mission particularly challenging was the location where Maria was being held. The building was a former government compound that the insurgents had turned into a fortress, complete with multiple layers of defensive positions and an unknown number of fighters. Intelligence suggested that the enemy was prepared to execute their prisoner if any rescue attempt was detected. Harrison studied the reconnaissance photos that showed the compound from every possible angle. The building sat in the center of a densely populated neighborhood, surrounded by narrow streets that would make a conventional assault nearly impossible. The insurgents had chosen their location well, knowing that any military operation in the area would risk significant civilian casualties. The SEAL commander knew that time was working against them. Each day Maria remained in captivity increased the likelihood that she would be moved to another location or killed for propaganda purposes. Intelligence reports indicated that several foreign fighters had arrived in Fallujah specifically to participate in what they planned to be a public execution. Harrison's team began immediate preparations for what would be one of the most complex rescue operations of the Iraq War. They studied building blueprints, analyzed guard patterns, and developed multiple contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. The mission would require split-second timing and perfect coordination between ground forces and air support. The team selected for the operation consisted of 8 of the most experienced special operations soldiers in the military. Each man had participated in dozens of similar missions, but none had faced the unique challenges presented by Maria's situation. They would be operating in hostile territory, with limited backup options, and the knowledge that failure would mean death for both their team and the Marine they were trying to save. As they prepared their equipment, Harrison reflected on the reports he had read about Maria's heroic actions in Fallujah. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for her fellow Marines embodied the same values that drove his team to risk their lives for others. They weren't just rescuing a wounded soldier. They were saving someone who represented the best of American military service. The insertion plan called for the SEAL team to approach the compound under cover of darkness, using the complex network of sewers and abandoned buildings that connected throughout that section of Fallujah. They would have to navigate through territory controlled by insurgents, while carrying enough equipment to breach the fortified building and extract Maria intelligence. Updates continued to arrive as the team finalized their preparations. The latest reports indicated that Maria's condition had deteriorated significantly during her captivity, and medical personnel estimated that she had perhaps 48 hours before her injuries became fatal without proper treatment. The pressure to execute the mission quickly was enormous. Harrison made the decision to launch the operation despite several unknown variables that normally would have delayed a mission of this complexity. They didn't know exactly how many insurgents were guarding the compound, and they had no way to confirm Maria's precise location within the building, but waiting for better intelligence might mean arriving too late to save her life. The night before the mission, Harrison gathered his team for their final briefing. He explained that this operation would likely be the most dangerous of their careers, with minimal backup and extraction options if something went wrong. Every man on the team volunteered to continue, understanding that they might not return from this mission. As they loaded their equipment and prepared for insertion, Harrison received word that insurgent activity in Fallujah had increased significantly over the past 24 hours. Enemy fighters were moving through the city in larger numbers, possibly in preparation for moving their prisoner to a new location. The window of opportunity for a successful rescue was closing rapidly. The helicopter that would carry the SEAL team into Iraq lifted off from their base as the sun set over the desert. 8 warriors were heading into the darkness, determined to bring home a fellow soldier who had already given everything for her country. They knew that Maria Santos was counting on them, even if she didn't know they were coming. The SEAL team helicopter approached the insertion point 15 kilometers outside Fallujah, under the cover of a moonless night. Harrison and his 7 teammates checked their equipment one final time as the aircraft descended toward a predetermined landing zone in the Iraqi desert. Each man carried specialized gear designed for close-quarters combat and explosive breaching operations. The helicopter touched down for exactly 30 seconds, just long enough for the team to exit and disappear into the darkness. Within minutes, the aircraft was gone, leaving the SEALs alone in hostile territory with nothing but their training and determination to guide them to their objective. They had approximately 6 hours to reach the compound, rescue Maria, and make it to their extraction point. Moving through the desert in perfect silence, the team covered the first 10 kilometers in under 2 hours. They avoided main roads and known insurgent patrol routes, using night vision equipment to navigate through terrain that would have been impassable in daylight. Harrison led from the front, constantly checking his GPS coordinates to ensure they remained on course. As they approached the outskirts of Fallujah, the team encountered their first major obstacle. Intelligence reports had indicated that insurgents maintained checkpoints on all major routes into the city, but recent enemy activity had resulted in additional roadblocks that weren't shown on their maps. The SEALs would have to find an alternate route through the urban maze. Harrison made the decision to enter the city through the industrial district, where abandoned factories and warehouses would provide cover during their movement to the target compound. This route added an additional kilometer to their journey, but it offered the best chance of reaching Maria without being detected by enemy patrols. The team split into 2 4-man elements to reduce their visibility as they moved through the bombed-out streets of Fallujah. Harrison led the first element while his second-in-command, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Mitchell, commanded the trailing group. They maintained radio contact using encrypted communications that couldn't be intercepted by insurgent monitoring equipment. Halfway through the city, Harrison's element encountered an insurgent patrol moving through an intersection they needed to cross. The enemy fighters were heavily armed and seemed to be conducting a systematic search of the surrounding buildings. The SEALs took cover in a destroyed shop and waited for nearly an hour until the patrol moved on to another area. When they finally reached the target compound, the building appeared exactly as described in their intelligence briefings. The 3-story structure was surrounded by a high concrete wall topped with razor wire, and armed guards were visible at multiple positions around the perimeter. Lights in several windows indicated that the building was fully occupied by enemy fighters. The SEALs spent 30 minutes conducting a detailed reconnaissance of the compound, identifying guard positions and potential entry points. They counted at least 12 insurgents on the visible perimeters, but intelligence estimates suggested that twice that number might be inside the building. The rescue operation would have to be executed with surgical precision to avoid a prolonged firefight. Harrison's plan called for simultaneous breaches at 2 different locations, designed to confuse the defenders and prevent them from organizing a coordinated response. While one element created a diversion at the front of the building, the primary assault team would breach the rear wall and move directly to Maria's suspected location on the 2nd floor. At exactly 300 hours, the operation began. Chief Mitchell's element detonated a small explosive charge near the compound's main gate, creating enough noise and confusion to draw the attention of most guards. Simultaneously, Harrison's team used thermal cutting tools to create an entry point through the rear wall of the compound. The first phase of the assault went according to plan. Harrison's team eliminated 2 guards silently and entered the building through a ground-floor window. Using their building blueprints, they moved quickly through the darkened corridors toward the staircase. That would take them to the 2nd floor where intelligence suggested Maria was being held. The SEALs encountered their first significant resistance as they reached the 2nd floor landing. 3 insurgents armed with automatic weapons opened fire from a defensive position at the end of the hallway. The confined space made the firefight extremely dangerous, with bullets ricocheting off concrete walls in every direction. Harrison and his teammates used advanced combat techniques to eliminate the threat without alerting other defenders in the building. They employed flashbang grenades to disorient the insurgents, followed by precise rifle fire that neutralized all 3 fighters within seconds. But the sound of gunfire had compromised their stealth advantage. Moving quickly down the hallway, the SEALs began checking each room systematically. They found evidence that prisoners had been held in several locations, including bloodstains and makeshift restraints, but no sign of Maria. Time was running out, and they could hear enemy fighters mobilizing throughout the building in response to the attack. In the 4th room they searched, Harrison found what they had come for. Maria lay unconscious on a concrete floor, her Marine uniform torn and bloodied from her original wounds and additional injuries inflicted during her captivity. She was barely breathing, and her skin was pale from blood loss and dehydration, but she was alive. Chief Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio with an urgent update. Enemy reinforcements were arriving at the compound, and his diversion team was taking heavy fire. The SEALs had perhaps 5 minutes to extract Maria and reach their predetermined escape route before being completely surrounded by hostile forces. Harrison knelt beside Maria's unconscious form and quickly assessed her condition. Despite the additional trauma she had endured during captivity, her pulse was steady, and she was breathing on her own. The SEAL team medic immediately began administering intravenous fluids while Harrison carefully lifted her onto a specialized stretcher designed for combat. Evacuations. The sound of gunfire was intensifying throughout the compound as Chief Mitchell's diversion team engaged the arriving insurgent reinforcements. Over his radio, Harrison could hear Mitchell coordinating his team's defensive positions while calling for immediate extraction support. They had successfully drawn enemy attention away from the rescue operation, but their own situation was becoming desperate. Harrison's team moved quickly through the building with their precious cargo, but Maria's unconscious weight made their movement slower and more difficult than planned. They had to navigate the same staircase and corridors they had cleared during their entry. But now insurgents were flooding into the building from multiple directions, searching for the American commandos who had penetrated their stronghold. As they reached the ground floor, the SEALs encountered a group of 5 insurgents moving through the main hallway. The enemy fighters were focused on reaching the upper floors where the initial firefight had occurred, and they didn't immediately notice the black-clad figures emerging from the stairwell. This momentary advantage allowed Harrison's team to eliminate the threat before any alarm could be raised. The rear exit they had used for entry was now compromised. With insurgent voices audible just outside the breach point in the compound wall, Harrison made the split-second decision to use their alternate escape route through the building's basement, even though this path would take them directly underneath the main concentration of enemy fighters. The basement of the compound was a maze of storage rooms and maintenance tunnels that connected to the city's pre-war infrastructure. Using their architectural intelligence, the SEALs navigated through the underground passages while carrying Maria on the stretcher. Each step had to be carefully planned to avoid making noise that might alert the insurgents above. 20 minutes after beginning their extraction, Harrison's team emerged from a drainage tunnel 6 blocks away from the compound. They immediately established radio contact with their extraction helicopter, which had been circling at a safe distance while monitoring the situation. The pilot reported that he could see multiple fires burning in the compound area and heavy insurgent movement throughout the surrounding neighborhood. Chief Mitchell's diversion team was still engaged in combat at the original site, but they had successfully prevented the insurgents from organizing an effective pursuit of the primary rescue team. Mitchell reported 2 wounded members of his element, but all 4 SEALs were still operational and fighting their way toward their own extraction point on the opposite side of the compound. The extraction helicopter arrived at Harrison's location exactly on schedule, despite the dangerous conditions created by insurgent anti-aircraft weapons in the area. The pilot brought his aircraft down in a small clearing between destroyed buildings, maintaining power and rotor speed for the fastest possible departure once his passengers were aboard. As the SEALs loaded Maria into the helicopter, she briefly regained consciousness. Her eyes opened just long enough to focus on Harrison's face, and she whispered a single word that he would never forget. Team. Even in her weakened condition, her first concern was for the Marines she had saved with her heroic actions in that Fallujah street. Harrison assured Maria that her entire team had survived because of her sacrifice, and that information seemed to give her peace as she slipped back into unconsciousness. The helicopter medic took over her care during the flight to the military hospital, monitoring her vital signs and administering medications to stabilize her condition for the journey ahead. The second extraction helicopter successfully recovered Chief Mitchell's team after a running firefight through the streets of Fallujah. All 8 SEALs had completed their mission and were returning safely, having accomplished what many military experts had considered an impossible rescue operation. Not a single American life had been lost during the mission. 3 hours after the rescue, Maria was back in the hands of military medical professionals who could provide the advanced treatment her injuries required. The additional trauma she had suffered during captivity had complicated her condition, but doctors were cautiously optimistic about her chances for recovery now that she was receiving proper care. The success of the SEAL rescue operation remained classified for several years after the war, but Maria's story eventually became known throughout the military community. Her actions in Fallujah had saved 6 Marines, and the courage of 8 SEALs had saved her life in return. It was a perfect example of the military's commitment to leaving no one behind. Harrison visited Maria during her recovery at the military hospital in Germany. She had no memory of the rescue operation itself, but she understood that Special Operations Forces had risked their lives to bring her home. The meeting between the Marine sergeant and the SEAL commander was brief, but both understood the bond that connected all warriors who were willing to sacrifice everything for their fellow service members. Maria's physical recovery took nearly 2 years, and she was eventually medically retired from the Marines with full honors. She received the Navy Cross for her heroic actions in Fallujah, becoming one of the most decorated female Marines in history. But she always insisted that the real heroes were the men who came back for her when it seemed impossible. Years later, when asked about her experience in Fallujah, Maria would say that she had simply done what any Marine would do for their team. She never considered herself a hero, despite carrying 14 bullets in her body as permanent reminders of her courage. For her, the true measure of success was that every Marine under her command had made it home safely to their families, and that was worth any price she had to pay.